Ian, thank you very much first off for spending the time to talk with MMOBuff.TV. Perhaps you could give us a quick intro and a little bit of a background as to what you do, what makes up your day to day.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here talking to you. My name is Ion Hazzikostas. I'm the lead encounter designer on the World of Warcraft team, so I have the team that makes the dungeon and raid content, and here to talk about Warlords of Draenor.
Fabulous. I guess we'll probably jump straight in a raiding direction.
Sure.
We've seen a lot of evolution in the game over a number of years. Where is your vision for raiding going forwards? Where are the highlights you've taken from the past, and what's that future goal?
So I think the one key word here is flexible. We've started and gone through a number of different raid structures in World of Warcraft over the years, starting with 40-player raiding as the only type of raiding when the game launched. We saw the introduction of 20-player raids in Zul'Gurub and the original Ruins of Ahn'Qiraj way back in the day. Over time we've evolved to a 25 and 10 parallel structure, and that's sort of where we've been in a holding pattern since Cataclysm. In patch 5.4, the most recent patch in Mizpah, we introduced a new flexible raid mode, which was both a somewhat easier difficulty that was a step below normal, but also, crucially, allowed content to scale seamlessly with the number of players present, anywhere from 10 to 25. So, for the first time, you could actually raid with 16 people, and you could actually have a situation where you have a raid where if someone has to go midway, or if someone else logs in midway, they can leave or join, and it's not disruptive to the group. We've been really enthusiastic, really excited to see the reception to that feature overall and how players have really embraced it. And we approached Warlords raiding thinking about how we could build upon that success and expand the reach of that flexible structure to open raiding up to more people than ever before, and to let its benefits be available to more people than ever before.
So just a quick question, as we open things up and as more and more people get to experience the content, sometimes it can be described as being a little bit tourist mode. I can come here, I can sit back, I can hit a couple of buttons, and I'll see all the bosses, I'll see all the content that's out there.
Yes.
If you want to introduce both a social connection so everyone can play, but keep difficulty, particularly for those players that have been around the block a few times, how well do you find that scales? And obviously now we're throwing Mythic into the mix. Perhaps you could give us a description and a breakdown of those difficulty levels, and really trying to let people know that the challenge perhaps will be there and where it will be.
Oh, of course. So I think that we've really found that the single biggest delineation is between random match-made groups like we have in Raid Finder and any kind of pre-made group of friends, or even a pre-made group that's actually a pickup group that has a clear leader and someone who's kind of filtering people and screening them to meet some threshold criteria before they'll join. In those random match-made groups, we found, yes, honestly, I think it's not necessarily inapt to call it tourist mode to an extent. The purpose of Raid Finder really is to allow people who have, don't necessarily want to make a time commitment, don't necessarily want to deal with the social engagement of a large guild. Maybe you can just drop in, queue up for Raid Finder over your lunch break, and see a portion of the raid. Raid Finder lets those people work on their characters and maybe alts, or their mains, however they prefer, but it lets them see the content they otherwise might not be able to see the conclusion to stories. Years ago, only a select handful of players got to actually defeat Illidan, let alone kill Jaden. Whereas today, everyone has been able, who is interested, to face off against Deathwing or Garrosh and see the conclusion of the major story arcs we've introduced in those expansions. So I think that Raid Finder, as sort of a casual, match-made, accessible form of raiding, really isn't changing very much, or at all. But however, for organized raiding, that's really, we do want to keep ultimately an appropriate level of challenge. And it's possible for that to be too easy as well as too hard. Ideally, you want something that is going to be engaging and stimulating for a specific group of players, and make them feel like they actually have to adapt and work to achieve a victory so that the victory feels meaningful. If it's too hard, of course, you just get frustrated, but it being too easy isn't very good either. And so we've found, as we have our current structure in 5.4, continuing to 6.0, that really 3 difficulties of organized raiding is the right number. You have what we call flexible today, will be known as normal in Warlords, for really friends and family groups, pickup groups, more casual groups that aren't necessarily selecting on the basis of skill, but more about, you just want to play with who you like. Then you have this intermediate tier, which we today call normal, but will be called heroic in Warlords of Draenor, which is for raiding guilds. It's for groups that are actually recruiting on the basis of skill. That is their primary factor that brings them together. They may not be, friends and family. They're people that formed up to fight and kill raid bosses. And that's kind of what we can call the mainstream raider, maybe. Then at the highest end of that spectrum, you have hardcore raiding guilds. You have the guilds that really are raiding more hours a week. They are being exceptionally selective in their recruitment criteria. And there are current heroic raiders, and that's who mythic raiding is for, going into Warlords.
Let's do a design question.
Sure.
If you're trying to address 3 broad strata of raiders while designing a piece of content, you're obviously going to be able to present very different challenges. What's your baseline? Do you, for example, have all these encounter mechanics are in this pot? We know that a less commuted group can deal with these, so we'll use them. These particular design concepts, well, these are only on the top shelf for people in this group. How do you design an encounter to build in the spread of difficulty?
So I think we generally approach an encounter by designing the baseline, sort of middle tier organized raid difficulty, so what you would today would call normal. And then from there, we, sometimes there are mechanics that we realize after we go into testing that they actually are more complex than we had intended, or maybe too complex for that audience. Often some of those end up becoming heroic only mechanics. To use a random example, on Darumu, the original iteration of Darumu, had the parasite debuff that went on random players that had to be dispelled. That was originally just a base part of the encounter. At some point we realized, wow, there's a lot going on in this fight already. Let's take one of these abilities and make it heroic only. That happened with that, in addition to, of course, the ice walls and some of the other quirks on that heroic version. Then, so from that middle tier baseline, we go in both directions. We will add additional mechanics to increase complexity, to increase the demands upon execution and awareness for the hardcore raider, and we will somewhat tone them down. Certainly, we will often remove them entirely for Raid Finder, because anything that requires extreme personal responsibility, or where a single person's action or inaction can spell doom for the entire group, those aren't very well suited for Raid Finder, because ultimately, you don't want one person to be able to sabotage everybody. We found that for Flexible currently, and comparing normal and heroic in the Warlords schema, that actually the mechanics are almost completely identical. We just really make numbers adjustments, but we want it to feel like really when you're doing that normal mode raid in Warlords, you're seeing all the same mechanics as the heroic raider is. They're just slightly more forgiving, they allow you to adapt a bit more, and DPS checks in particular maybe aren't as tight.
Okay, let's keep on the design theme for a moment then.
Sure.
How do you baseline such things as damage numbers, health pools, rate of regen, healing, and everything else, particularly with the item squish we've just talked about?
Yes. So, I think that's always most challenging going into a new expansion, where the numbers have all changed so much, and there it's really based on data that we get from our class team and our systems teams, as well as extensive beta testing, and that really helps us refine and hone in on the target numbers. We have an internal test team that also helps get that data for us. When producing subsequent tiers of content within an expansion, it's actually much simpler because we actually have data from what players are actually doing in live. We can see, okay, the Heroic Throne of Thunder Raiders that are doing Heroic Throne of Thunder this week, this is the damage they're actually doing. We can probably expect they're going to do something similar when Siege of Orgrimmar opens, and we can tune accordingly. The item squish, really, it changes the numbers, but it doesn't actually change much beyond the absolutes there. In relative terms, a Siege of Orgrimmar piece of gear is still going to be 30 or 40% stronger than a Throne of Thunder piece of gear. A player who's Siege of Orgrimmar geared is still going to be, in percentage terms, stronger than a Throne of Thunder geared player. Things will still do the same percentage of a player's health in terms of damage, in terms of healing. So really it's more just about getting the numbers back into the realm of sanity and not necessarily about changing the relative balance of anything.
Okay, so would it be fair to say then that the impact of a modifier in terms of the way it will adjust a given stat or a hit is going to change, but the end value is going to stay the same, hence why the comment of backscaling to old content and why that will still be viable? Or are there more tweaks having to be made in the background?
There are more tweaks. I think the absolute numbers are changing. So it's that, a player will still have the same crit chance and so forth, though you'll need less rating to get that same crit chance. But yeah, you will have less spell power, your fireball will hit less hard, you will have less health in absolute terms everywhere. What we're exploring, what we're going to do, is something along the lines of when you go into older content, when you fight against creatures that are much lower level than you, you're going to get a damage bonus against those creatures, and a damage taken penalty. Such that the goal is, today, if you walk up and Pyroblast Kael'thas and that takes off 20% of his health, if you do that after the squish, it'll take off 20% of his health. And if he hits you and it takes off 2% of your health, his attack will also take off 2% of your health after the squish.
Okay, and the same thing, I guess, will apply to buffs and everything else. Everything is just going to have to be affected by that modifier?
Yes.
Fine. Okay. Perhaps another mechanics one.
Sure.
Whereas raids have got a little, perhaps more compact in recent terms, we have, especially more recently, seen some great mechanics. Perhaps you could share some insight, obviously you can't name names or anything else, but perhaps a mechanic or something intriguing that we haven't yet seen that you're able to explore in Warlords.
Honestly, there isn't a specific example I can give, but I can say that in general terms, we are always looking to introduce new wrinkles to some of the familiar mechanics, but also to introduce things that players haven't precisely seen before. I think one of the big things that we made use of in Mist was the ability to have movement forces exerted on players, so wind that can actually blow you in a certain direction, or a conveyor belt in the case of Siegecraft or Blackfuse that you can struggle against or run with to gain a speed boost. It lets you interact with your environment in ways that you hadn't previously been able to do. So we're thinking along those lines, and we always like to unveil one or two surprises along with each expansion to change things up for many of our longtime players who think they've seen everything. We'll have some tricks up our sleeve for them.
Okay. I'll leave you with a closing question because I think the time is moving on.
Sure.
Of all the changes you've implemented, perhaps more recently, patch 5.4, MOP, etc., what is the change that you're most pleased with? What is the change that said, well, this was my design goal, and we've really hit it?
Speaking not personally, but on behalf of my team as a whole, I would say flexible rating. I think that really flexible rating has the promise to open rating up to more people than ever before, and it removes all of the social downsides that are commonly associated with organized rating. The feeling of obligation, the feeling of, well, if something comes up tonight and I don't make it to my raid, I'm letting my team down. There are going to be 9 people standing around disappointed they don't get to raid anymore. All of that is gone. As a raid leader, really ideally you actually want just the right number of people to log on for your raid every night. You certainly don't want too few, because then you're all standing around boned. But if you have too many, well, that's actually rough too, because then you have to figure out who has to sit out.
You're picking the lesser evil.
Exactly. But with flexible rating, everyone who's around can participate, and you can just focus on having fun and doing the content, and not the social logistics.
Thank you very much, Ian. Much appreciated.
Pleasure.
Thank you for your time. This is Mizpah from MMOBuff.TV, signing out.